For thousands of years, the grammar translate method, as it's called, has been used for teaching a second language. But today, in many circles, it actually has a really bad reputation. Why is that? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you the two main reasons I think the grammar translate method has run into problems. And in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the things we can do perhaps to solve that. Hey, I'm Daryl Burling from Biblical Mastery Academy, here to help you with the tools, habits, and systems to master the Greek of the New Testament. There is a sort of a trend, if you like, that's arguing from the linguistics world that really the grammar translate method does not work. Now, I think there are actually some real advantages of the grammar translate method, and I'll talk about those in the next video. But in this video, I want to talk about why the grammar translate method actually does have some real problems. Now, before I start, let me just explain what I mean by the grammar translate method. This method, this title, this name, the grammar translate method, refers to the idea of teaching people the grammar and how things work from a grammatical point of view. So the Basics of Biblical Greek by Bill Mounce, Beginning with New Testament Greek by Dr. Plummer and Merkel, all these sorts of books. These are all grammar translate method approaches. Now, most of the grammars that we have today are actually grammar translate approaches. There's not very many that are using a natural language approach to teach Greek. Now, there are a few, and you can probably think of some off the top of your head. However, those are different. They don't typically start with, here's the rules of the grammar, here's how this is going to work in one language, compare it to another, and so on. Now, both the grammar translate method and the natural language approach have both existed side by side for millennia. You could argue perhaps that the natural language approach is the older approach because it's frankly what we've used to learn living languages. When you go into an immersive environment, you will learn a language just by picking up individual words and how they're strung together in a very organic kind of way. However, starting from about the time of Aristotle and Plato, around that time, people started to work with the grammar translate method. They developed this method because it was a really fast way to start to learn to read books from ancient cultures. And so it was a really attractive approach for doing that. Now I'll talk about some of the benefits again in the next video, but for the moment, just know that the grammar translate method refers to this method where we teach grammar and then we explain how this works in another language. And then you can learn that other language by understanding the grammar. Hence the grammar, and we then go to translate the material in that other language into our own native or heart language, if you want to call it that. So why has the grammar translate method fallen into such hard times? Well, the first reason is because our educational approach has fundamentally changed. What do I mean by that? Well, it's very simple. If you go back 100 years in the education world, pretty much everybody was taught using the classical education model. Now, in primary school, the classic education model in primary school would teach you what's called the trivium. The trivium consists of three parts: logic, rhetoric, and grammar. And what's happened is that over the last 100 years, the modern world has effectively said, well, we don't like that approach to teaching anybody anymore, and so we're going to change it. And what's happened as a result of that is that we actually really, for the most part, don't teach grammar or logic or rhetoric for that matter either to children anymore, which then means, of course, that this has massive ripple-on effects that we're actually dealing with today, particularly when it comes to learning Greek. Now, there's a number of flow-on effects, I think, that have come about because we no longer teach using the classical education approach. For instance, not knowing grammar has an effect on the way we understand language. And in fact, we would argue, well, why should we bother to actually learn the grammar? Because we can speak our own language perfectly adequately without learning the grammar of it at all. And hence, the natural language approach is really attractive to us because we don't have to learn the grammar. But there's some other things as well. Namely, as English has become the main language, not only have we lost an interest in learning other languages, but we've actually also lost a bit of our interest in history as well, because one of the reasons that we taught grammar to children was not only so they could understand their own language, but also so they could start to read some of the material out of the classic literature from Latin and from Greek in particular. And typically the classical education model would teach children Latin and or Greek as they were going up through the primary years, because it's going to give them that broad understanding of history and culture and literature, and that gives them not only an idea of how language works, but also an idea of where we've come from, how we got here, and who we are as people, as heirs, if you like, of all of this history and literature and so on. And I think as a result of this, we've kind of lost a little bit of our identity as well. And of course, another effect of all of this is that because we're no longer interacting with these ancient texts, neither are we thinking about their philosophy, the philosophical ideas that have been put forward, the logic that comes with that, or even the religion that has sort of permeated the world for thousands of years, and we've largely discarded all of these things. So there's some pretty major effects of losing this classical education approach. But the point here is not to argue that we should go back to a classical education. The point here is to argue that because we no longer teach grammar to children, and we therefore as adults no longer know grammar, we come to the grammar translate method without what I would say is the prerequisite knowledge to actually take advantage of these materials that have been written for us. And as a result, we look at those books and those tools and we say they just don't work. So let's ask the question, is the grammar translate method the problem in this situation? Well, perhaps. You could argue that it's up to the writers of these books to actually look at the educational ground underneath them to ask the question, do my students who are going to pick this book up have the educational prerequisites to be able to actually use the material that I'm writing? And so I think there is, to some extent, a requirement on the authors of books to actually teach grammar well. And to be certain, many grammars, Greek grammars in particular I'm talking about here, do actually teach some English grammar pretty well. I think Bill Mounce in Basics of Biblical Greek does a pretty reasonable job of this. I think Beginning with New Testament Greek does a reasonable job with this as well. But perhaps some of these grammars could have a little bit more, and perhaps some of their writing could be a little clearer. And certainly there are grammars that have absolutely no English grammar in them whatsoever, and just assume that you can pick up a possessive case in English and you know what that means, and you can then apply that knowledge to Greek as well, along with all the other grammatical concepts as well, such as prepositions and so on and so forth. So yes, I think there is some requirement on the people who are authoring these grammar translate method tools for them to be able to actually meet their students where they are and bring them up to the level they need to be, rather than just assuming that they've got the prerequisite skills to start with. And this would be a place where I'd want to pause and just say to seminary professors, if you're teaching Greek to students using a Greek grammar that doesn't actually teach English grammar, make sure that when you come to the classroom, you are actually going through the basics of English grammar with your students, or they're going to be completely lost, and it's going to be frustrating for both them and for you as well. So with that aside, let's move on. But with that in mind, let's talk about the flip side of that. The argument that I'm trying to address here is that those people who say the grammar translate method doesn't work. My argument here is actually we're trying to blame the tool when really the problem is actually with the user of the tool. If we don't have the prerequisite knowledge when we come into a classroom, you know, we wouldn't expect to come into that classroom. And the same should apply to the grammar translate method too. Just because the grammar translate method is designed for those who have got an understanding of the grammar doesn't mean to say that when we come in, if we don't have that knowledge of the grammar, that the system itself is broken. The system is broken, but it's not this system, it's actually the big, larger educational approach. That's what's really broken. So we can't necessarily blame the tools when there's been a larger issue taking place underneath the tools and they haven't, and here's where I go back to my perhaps, yes, there's a responsibility on the authors here, they haven't really kept up with that ground shift that takes place or has taken place underneath them. So I think we need to be wiser about the way we talk about the grammar translate method. It's been used for centuries. Why would we suddenly now have a problem with it? Well, again, I don't think it's the approach taken in these grammars. I think it's actually the fact that the ground beneath the grammars, the pedagogical foundation, if you like, has shifted, which has made the whole approach much more challenging than it would have been, say, 100 years ago. So that's the first problem. The grammar translate method today is fundamentally challenged in part because we no longer know grammar because we're not taught it in schools. So that brings us to one of the other main arguments against the grammar translate method. And that is that so many students who start with the grammar translate method, they actually end up losing their Greek. And again, does this mean that the grammar translate method is the problem, or is there something else going on here? Well, my take, you might have already guessed this, is there's actually something else going on here. When we go back to the trivium and the classical education system and it taught grammar, one of the reasons we taught grammar to children was not only so that they could understand how language is structured in their own language and be able to use it well, but also so that they could go back and read those ancient texts. Note the word there, read those ancient texts. Today, when you go to seminary and you learn Greek, you typically will not be taught to read Greek. Instead, you'll be expected to learn grammar, and then the next class you're probably going to do is exegesis. Exegesis is not reading the language. This means then that you learn those basic skills required to actually read the text, and then you suddenly stop before you've actually acquired skill with that new knowledge. It's a little bit like learning to drive a car. You get into the car, you learn how to use a stick shift, you learn the clutch, you get your basic license perhaps. I don't know how old you are. When I got my license, it was just do one license exam and you got your license kind of thing. It was much easier back then. And then you kind of had, you got your car and away you go. The problem was, of course, that I needed to get around, so I needed to use the car, which means I needed to develop those skills. However, if I've kind of learnt those basic skills, even though I lack confidence, even though I lack the competence even that a skilled and experienced driver would have, I still need to get around from A to B, and that's going to force me then to get that experience. But that doesn't happen with languages. There's no need for you to go and read these ancient languages, and you've got very good English translations, which means you don't even need to read your Bible in the original language, even though you might know the basics of how the grammar works together. So that means then, why would you actually go do that when you feel like you don't have the competence, you don't have the confidence, you feel like you suck? And so why would you actually go and try doing that rather than whatever it is you put in front of you to do today? And so here's the problem. The problem is that we actually don't develop the necessary skill to use the information about the grammar that we've just learned through beginning Greek. This means that when we finish beginning Greek, we're like that driver. We don't have the confidence, we don't have the competence, we don't have the skills, and we don't have the experience. And on top of that, in most seminaries, they're not actually going to give you the instructions for how to gain that experience and how to gain those skills. And in many cases, the actual professors teaching you won't have those skills themselves. And so therefore, you're kind of left sitting there with your car keys in your car and nowhere to go and no incentive to actually get in the car and get the practice and get the skills that you actually need. Again, is the grammar translate method the problem here? I don't think so. Again, the problem is that you've been brought to the edge of what the grammar translate method was supposed to do, give you those basic skills, but then you've kind of been dropped off a cliff to say, well, now you've got nothing to do with it. And what's going to happen? Well, you're not going to use those skills, you're not going to develop them, and as a result, they fall by the wayside, and so many students who learn Greek in seminary end up losing their Greek after they finish seminary. Again, exegesis, as good as it is, as necessary as it is not sufficient to help you ground those skills that you really need to be able to develop the language knowledge and experience and skills that are really going to pay off. And so these are the two major issues, I think, that are addressed to the grammar translate method that I don't believe are actually problems with the method itself. They're problems with the educational framework beneath them and how they're used, and even the outcome that we're trying to drive students to in seminaries and Bible colleges and so on as well. So from my point of view, I actually don't think, I am not convinced that the grammar translate method is a big problem. If you are interested in learning to read the New Testament in the original language, well, I would like to think that we've actually started to work on the grammar translate method to rehabilitate it, to make it so that it works for people who haven't learned grammar in primary school, don't really have a good understanding of it, but also aren't going through seminary and so aren't forced to kind of push through for the sake of just getting the grades or whatever. So if you really are interested in getting directly into the text of the New Testament and reading the New Testament in the original language in a very quick manner, go to bma.to/get started and we'll get you into our Getting Started course, which is free, and it's just going to give you a bit of an overview of what's involved and what you need to know. So bma.to/get started. And if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know if you think I'm wrong. I'd love to hear why. Give me your reasoned explanation below. I'd love to hear from you there. And if you did learn using the Grammar Translate method and you did go on to develop the skills, well, jump in the comments below and let me know what you actually did to develop those skills. Now, if you're interested in more on this, in the next video, I'm going to talk about what we can do to actually change the ground, if you like, how we can actually use the Grammar Translate method, and even why rehabilitate the Grammar Translate method as well. So I'll talk about all of that in the next video, but in the meantime, leave a comment below, let me know what you think. I look forward to seeing you and interacting with you there in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. In the meantime, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. We'll see you there.